They yanked him through the lobby like a criminal, his black skin treated as a threat before his mouth even opened, his polished shoes sliding against cold marble, while neckties and pearl earrings watched in silence, some smirking, none stepping in, a grown man, well-dressed and composed, reduced to a scene, shoved aside without a question, without a name, as if dignity didn't belong to his skin tone, as if presence alone was offense enough to be manhandled in daylight. And the twisted part is, they thought they got away with it, thought the man they humiliated was just another nobody. But what they didn't know was that every step he took out that door was a quiet countdown to their collapse. So if you're watching this and believe that silence has limits, that dignity can look like patience, but hit like justice, hit the like button, subscribe for more stories like this, and drop a comment with where you're watching from. Because the moment you look away from injustice, you join it. A tall black man in a muted wool suit enters the grand lobby of Claiborne Reserve Bank. His coat, pressed but simple, stands out among silk ties and sharp blazers. He doesn't speak. He simply walks with quiet purpose toward the service counter. But within seconds, the lead security guard, Doyle, moves with a sneer etched across his face. Without asking anything, Emmett clutches the man's forearm as if seizing a shoplifter. Not gently, not respectfully. He jerks him backward in full view of suited clients, who pause and stare with tilted heads and parted lips. One woman chuckles behind her hand. A child nearby asks if he's in trouble. Emmett marches the man across the echoing floor, one hand still clenched tight around his arm, his other hand resting arrogantly on his own belt. The man stumbles once as his shoes scrape the polished tile. A cluster of interns in press shirts smirk from behind the reception desk. None offer help. The marble underfoot is slick and hard, each step amplified by the cavernous lobby. Each drag of the man's polished shoe a subtle sound of degradation. The man doesn't resist, doesn't shout, doesn't beg for explanation. His silence is not compliance, it is restraint. But Emmett takes silence as submission, and submission as weakness. They pass by a seating area where two business clients in fine suits sip their complimentary espresso. One of them leans toward the other and mumbles something, causing them both to grin while keeping their eyes fixed on the man being hauled away. The receptionist at the main desk glances briefly at a screen and then away again, pretending to be busy adjusting brochures. She knows better than to ask questions. The man's black notebook slips from his fingers and lands on the floor with a flat, unceremonious slap. Emmett doesn't notice. Or maybe he does, and just doesn't care. He keeps pulling the man forward with mechanical confidence, like this is a routine he has practiced many times. The notebook lies open, pages fluttering slightly in the air-conditioned breeze. No one moves to retrieve it. A junior teller nearby hesitates for a moment, takes one step forward, then changes his mind and walks in the opposite direction. Milton, the man in the suit, keeps his eyes forward, his jaw clenched, posture held upright despite the rough handling. This is not the first time he's felt fingers on his arm like this. It might be the 100th, but never in a place like this. Never here. Never now. Emmett finally shoves open the door to a side hallway leading to the vestibule reserved for security incidents. He pushes Milton inside with a grunt of effort and slams the door behind him, the lock clicking hard enough to echo. The vestibule is small, windowless, and bare. A camera blinks red in one corner, and a single overhead light casts a pale yellow glow over scuffed tile. No chairs, no desk. Just Milton and the staleness of a room designed for detainment, not comfort. On the other side of the bank, behind a glass partition, branch manager Evelyn watches the security feed with half interest. When her assistant asks who that was, she doesn't answer right away. She leans forward, adjusts her glasses, then shrugs and tells the assistant it's probably one of those walk-ins they get sometimes, the kind who don't understand how things work here. The assistant starts to ask another question, but Evelyn waves her off with a flick of her manicured hand. Tell security not to process anything until I've reviewed it personally, she says. Her tone is final, her posture confident. She turns back to her screen and opens an email thread marked internal escalation. Milton stands alone, arms at his side, coat slightly rumpled from the manhandling. He looks down at his sleeve, where Emmett's grip left creases in the fabric. Slowly, he brushes the spot with his hand, then smooths the rest of his coat. He bends down to retrieve his notebook from the hallway just outside the vestibule door, but it is gone. Someone must have picked it up or kicked it aside. He doesn't know. He doesn't ask. He just returns to standing still, eyes focused on the door that remains locked. Outside, Emmett returns to his post like nothing happened. He cracks his knuckles and leans back in his chair, saying something inaudible to another guard who smirks in reply. Clients come and go. Conversations resume. A deliverman brings in lunch bags and receives a smile from the receptionist. Life inside Claiborne Reserve Bank continues as if Milton Tarot does not exist. In the break room, Emmett reenacts his earlier grab for 2 off-duty guards, exaggerating the man's expression, mocking his silence, calling him slow, maybe drunk. They laugh. One of them says that kind always walks in thinking this is a bus terminal. Emmett leans back, proud. Evelyn passes by, hears the conversation, and keeps walking. Upstairs, a compliance officer sees a note flagged in the internal system about a suspicious individual being escorted off the floor. No name, no context, just an automated alert triggered by Evelyn's directive. The officer opens the file, sees no threat level, and closes it. Milton remains behind the locked vestibule door for nearly an hour. No one checks in. No one offers water. No one speaks to him. The lights buzz faintly above his head. His legs begin to ache. He shifts his weight from foot to foot, checks the time, then returns to stillness. The only movement is the slight tapping of one finger against his thigh, once every few seconds. That is the only indication he is thinking, calculating, waiting. Not pleading, not hoping, just waiting. When the door finally creaks open, it's not Emmett, but a young teller named Bryce who enters. He looks nervous, apologetic even, but says nothing meaningful. Just tells Milton to follow him. Milton complies, saying nothing. They walk back through the corridor, this time bypassing the lobby and heading toward a lesser-used customer interview room tucked behind the loan officer desks. The room has a table, one chair, and a pitcher of water that's been sitting too long. Bryce gestures to the seat and leaves. Milton sits, his face unreadable. Across the bank, Emmett watches the exchange on the monitor and scoffs. Should have kicked him out when we had the chance, he mutters. Evelyn hears it and does not respond. She is reviewing quarterly data on client satisfaction. Milton Tarot sat motionless in the cramped interview room, the edge of the table pressing lightly against his knees, the notebook resting flat before him like a quiet anchor. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and disinfectant, and the pitcher of water left on the corner table had long since gone stale, condensation drying along the glass like forgotten fingerprints. The single fluorescent light above buzzed with an occasional flicker, casting a sterile glow on the white walls and gray trim that made the space feel more like a detention cell than a banking office. Though he had been seated now for over 20 minutes, no one had returned. Bryce, the timid young teller who had led him here, had vanished the moment Milton sat down, muttering something vague about management review before disappearing through the narrow hallway door. Milton remained where he was, not because he felt welcome, but because he understood that to stand or to question might only provoke more of what had happened in the lobby. The bruise forming along his wrist from Emmett's grip throbbed faintly beneath his sleeve, and his coat, once immaculately pressed, now sagged unevenly from the earlier manhandling. He inhaled through his nose and exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like dust shaken off from something once polished. In the executive office upstairs, Evelyn Kerr leaned back in her high-back chair, flipping through client reports without urgency. She had seen Milton's name in the preliminary file now, though no details had been attached except for an internal note marking him as unknown, walk-in, possible ID verification required. She had not yet looked at the actual ID he had handed to Bryce. She didn't think it necessary. Her focus remained on the trust accounts slated for quarterly reviews, none of which, in her mind, would involve someone who looked like him. Beside her, her assistant Rhonda hesitated with a folder marked priority follow-up. It contained details on a trust account that had not yet been publicly linked to its new managing trustee, something involving a family foundation that rarely moved money without direct board approval. Rhonda started to mention it, but paused when she saw Evelyn's expression. Evelyn was still annoyed by what she referred to privately as the lobby disruption. She disliked unpredictability. Rhonda placed the file quietly back in the stack. Downstairs, Doyle returned to his surveillance screen, watching Milton through the camera mounted above the interview room door. Emmett leaned back in his chair, eating a sandwich with one hand while tapping his radio with the other, exchanging jokes with another guard in the back corridor. The screen flickered momentarily, then sharpened again, showing Milton exactly where he had been for the past 45 minutes, sitting, waiting, unmoving. Emmett scoffed under his breath. The guy wasn't even pacing. He called that suspicious. Why sit like that unless you're hiding something? He marked it down in the internal log. Still no progress. Subject uncooperative. Rhonda eventually brought the file Evelyn had ignored down to the compliance office for review, hoping someone with more procedural patience would glance at it. Inside was the name Milton Tarot, written in bold, with a title beneath it that no one here had yet recognized. Executive Trustee, Andersall Preservation Trust. Accompanying it was a letter of authority, signed and sealed, delegating full financial oversight to Milton for disbursement, asset movement, and client representation. The letter was notarized, time-stamped, and valid. But the compliance clerk reviewing the packet saw only the black and white print and didn't connect it with a man sitting alone downstairs. He placed the file in the low-priority stack. Meanwhile, clients filtered in and out of the main floor above Milton, attending meetings, signing documents, exchanging pleasantries with staff. Laughter floated from the executive lounge, where a midday reception was being held for premium account holders. Trays of smoked salmon and miniature quiches were passed by uniformed servers, while jazz music played softly from concealed speakers. Milton, below all of this, remained unseen. A few moments later, a new employee named Caleb entered the interview room with a guarded expression. He had been instructed by Evelyn to gather additional information from the individual in room 3, and though Caleb had not witnessed the lobby incident, he could feel the discomfort hanging in the air as soon as he stepped inside. Milton looked up briefly, nodded once, and gestured toward his notebook, which was now closed. Caleb cleared his throat, asked for identification, and was handed a leather-bound case containing several documents. As he reviewed the ID, his eyebrows furrowed. The name, the credentials, the formal tone of the associated documentation. They didn't match the narrative he'd been led to believe. Still, he said nothing. He stepped out to double-check with Evelyn. She dismissed it, told him to make a copy and leave the man where he was. She would get to it after her call. Caleb copied the documents, returned them to Milton without comment, and left again. Another hour passed. Then another. No one came back. The room grew colder as the afternoon sun began to shift. Milton shifted slightly in his chair, rolled his shoulders to ease the tightness, and unfolded his notebook again. He began writing. Not frantic scribbles or angry rants. Just measured sentences, structured, dated. Across the bank, no one paid attention to the man in room 3. They passed over his presence the way they ignored a smudge on glass. At one point, a janitor named Frankie paused outside the door with a mop and peeked through the small glass window. He had seen the dragging earlier, had heard the comments. His stomach twisted. He considered knocking, but instead he looked down, turned his cart, and walked the other way. Upstairs, Rhonda mentioned to Evelyn that the man was still in the room. The cold air wrapped around his wrists where his sleeves had ridden up from earlier, the spot where Doyle's hand had clamped down still tingling with soreness, the outline of his fingers faintly red beneath the fabric. He didn't hurry. He didn't pace. He simply walked with the calm dignity of someone who had learned long ago that silence was the only shield allowed in places where his presence was never expected to be respectful. From inside the bank, Emmett returned to his post by the front lobby entrance, nodding to a senior officer who had just come on rotation. The guard asked about the man they had just removed. and Emmett responded with a sneer that curled at the corner of his mouth. Said he was loitering, maybe fishing for information, maybe casing the place for something. The other guard chuckled and made a joke about folks dressing up now to play innocent, to blend in and pretend they have business with private banks. Emmett mimicked Milton's slow walk and exaggerated the way he nodded at the end. Said the man had an attitude without even speaking. A couple of junior staff passing by overheard the exchange and joined the laughter. One of them, a college intern named Dennis, mimicked Milton's voice, saying, "Sir, I have a meeting," in a fake stiff tone, followed by exaggerated fake politeness and bowed posture. The others roared with laughter. None of them knew who Milton was. None of them asked. Upstairs, Evelyn was finishing a virtual call with a client and preparing for a mid-afternoon meeting with regional leadership. She had not thought about the man since instructing Emmett to escort him out. In her mind, the incident had already passed into the background, nothing more than a minor interruption on a day otherwise occupied with numbers, reports, and projected asset growth. When her assistant Rhonda mentioned that the trust paperwork Milton had brought still hadn't been entered into the system, Evelyn rolled her eyes and told her to place it in the admin queue and flag it low priority. She said if it was real, someone else would call to confirm. If it wasn't, no time should be wasted on it. Rhonda hesitated, then obeyed. She didn't want to be accused of overstepping again. Meanwhile, down in the staff corridor near the security office, Emmett gathered a small group of employees, 2 tellers, 1 loan officer, and a guard, for a breakroom conversation that quickly turned into a retelling of the earlier encounter. He reenacted the dragging scene for them, using a nearby chair as a stand-in for Milton. He mimed grabbing the chair arm, jerking it to the side, and pulling it across the floor with a loud screech. He grunted, laughed, and pretended the chair tried to speak but couldn't get a word in. The group howled in laughter, some slapping the table, others repeating Emmett's movements. One teller asked what the guy even wanted. Emmett shrugged and said probably trying to make a scene and sue later. Said he was probably writing down lies in that notebook of his. Someone else joked maybe he was an author working on a novel called 50 Shades of Getting Dragged. The joke drew more laughter. Another guard added that people like that show up thinking just dressing the part is enough. They all nodded. None of them asked to see the man's ID. None of them considered he might have actually had business there. In the executive lounge upstairs, champagne flutes clinked softly while a group of wealth advisors toasted a recent acquisition. Music from a live pianist floated through the air, delicate and refined, matching the tone of the bank's most elite setting. Evelyn entered briefly, greeted a few high-net-worth clients, and gave a short speech about the growth trajectory of Claiborne Reserve's asset portfolio. She was composed, polished, elegant. Not a word of the lobby incident was mentioned. Not a whisper of what had happened below. For the staff, the story of Milton had already become legend. A tale of a presumptuous outsider getting put in his place. Outside, Milton had taken a seat on a concrete bench across the street from the bank. The wind had picked up, stirring the edges of his coat, making the corners of his notebook flap softly against his leg. He sat with his back straight, hands resting gently on the book, his eyes scanning the bank's entrance without anger or fear. Just clarity, just memory, just waiting. A woman pushing a stroller passed by, gave him a polite nod, and kept walking. A young man in a suit stepped out of the bank, looked at Milton with a hint of confusion, and then turned quickly away. Milton remained still, breathing evenly, anchoring himself in the moment without surrendering to it. He had come here for a reason. That reason had not changed. He watched as more staff moved through the glass doors, some glancing at him, others pretending not to see him at all. Back inside, in the staff locker room, Dennis pulled out his phone and began texting a friend about the incident, making jokes, referencing how Emmett had put the man in his place. He didn't post anything, didn't film it, just kept the humor alive in private chat threads. The culture of ridicule had already taken root, sprouting branches through whispers and snide comments that would continue long after Milton's presence had faded from the building. In the compliance office, The folder with Milton's documents sat untouched beneath a pile of more recent entries. No one had yet cross-referenced the trust name with internal records. No one had yet realized that the name Milton Tarot appeared on the top 5 clients update sent to regional leadership just 3 weeks prior. No one had connected the signature in his notebook to the one on record for the Andersall Preservation Trust, a signature that authorized movement of more funds than the entire branch had processed in the past quarter. A second courier arrived with another sealed envelope for compliance, this one marked confidential. It contained legal confirmation of Milton's authority for trust-related action. It too was placed in a tray. It too was ignored. The momentum of dismissal had already overtaken the institution, a current of arrogance and careless superiority sweeping every small piece of evidence into the dustbin of irrelevant paperwork. Later that evening, when staff began leaving for the day, Emmett was still telling the story of how he dragged the guy across the floor. Each time, the story grew more dramatic, more embellished, more theatrical. He added fake cries, fake resistance, described Milton's notebook as a prop. By the end of the day, most of the staff believed Milton had come in with some made-up title, looking for attention, trying to disrupt their professionalism. In their minds, he had no standing, no weight, no power, and certainly no place among them. As the sun dipped lower and the lights in the lobby began to dim, Milton finally stood from the bench, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He walked once more past the front doors of the bank, paused, looked inside, then turned away and continued down the street. The voices still rang in his ears, muffled laughs, condescending remarks, the absence of apologies louder than any insult. He thought of the young intern who had mimicked him, the guards who had played games with his dignity, and the woman at the top of the glass staircase who hadn't even cared enough to learn his name. Milton closed the notebook without writing anything. There were no words strong enough to record what it felt like to be reduced to nothing in a room full of people who had never known his name but were so quick to decide his worth. The bruise on his wrist had deepened by now, a blue and purple stain blooming against brown skin. He flexed his fingers slowly and adjusted the cuff of his coat to hide it. His overcoat still hung unevenly from being yanked, one lapel lower than the other, the fabric creased in sharp, unnatural lines. He could have straightened it, but didn't. He wanted to feel the folds, the shape of the moment still etched into the cloth. That evening, he returned to his apartment, a quiet top-floor unit overlooking a faded park with swings that creaked even when still. He placed the notebook on his desk and made tea with slow hands. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't call anyone. He let the quiet build around him like insulation. Meanwhile, at Claiborne Reserve, the jokes about the day's events had not stopped. In fact, they had spread. A few employees at a nearby branch had already heard about the mysterious man in a suit who had supposedly stormed in demanding access to accounts he didn't own. The details shifted with each telling. Some said he shouted. Others said he threatened lawsuits. Some said he was mentally unstable, scribbling notes about conspiracies. Emmett had become the unofficial narrator of the tale, feeding every retelling with more dramatic flair. The original facts had long been buried under a pile of embellishments. A new version claimed the man was escorted out by 3 guards. Another claimed he had tried to sneak in through the staff entrance. The truth no longer mattered. Milton had become a ghost story, a cautionary tale about letting outsiders feel entitled. Upstairs, Evelyn had dismissed the whole situation as resolved. She had told compliance to discard the ID documentation and not waste time confirming anything unless someone from corporate followed up. No one had. Rhonda, her assistant, had asked once more if she should at least forward the file to legal for record. Evelyn had snapped, said she didn't have time for irrelevant paperwork from strangers with no appointment and no merit. Rhonda dropped the subject. In the janitorial wing of the building, Frankie, the same cleaner who had considered speaking up earlier, finally looked up the name Milton Tarot that night on his phone, just to satisfy a gut feeling. The internet offered him little more than foundation documents and donation records tied to the Andersall Trust, but something about the phrasing on one page struck him. He found Milton's name listed as the executor of record, dated just 6 months earlier. Frankie read it twice, then closed the page. He considered telling someone, but the moment passed. He had rent to pay. Jobs like his didn't reward curiosity. The next morning, a client from another city walked into Claiborne Reserve requesting a scheduled meeting with the executive director regarding a mutual project funded by the Andersall Trust. He had been sent ahead to confirm planning for a fund expansion. The receptionist checked the system and found nothing logged under Milton Tarot's visit. No file, no meeting, no flag. She excused herself, asked Evelyn for clarification. Evelyn frowned, said the man who visited yesterday had no appointment and had caused a disruption. She called him a fraud in front of 2 staff members. The client raised an eyebrow. He asked to see the security footage. She declined. He asked to speak to someone at corporate. Evelyn told him it wasn't necessary. The client said nothing else, thanked her, and left the branch quietly. That same afternoon, he made a phone call to the legal office tied to the trust and expressed concern. His exact words were measured, but the meaning was clear. Something wasn't adding up. A few floors above, in the corporate legal department of the parent company, an assistant named Marlene flagged the incident and wrote up a preliminary incident file. She didn't escalate it yet, assuming it would resolve like most minor service disputes. But she noted the names involved: Emmett Doyle, Evelyn Kerr, and Milton Tarot. She placed the folder in the middle of her desk. Down at the branch, the same attitude persisted. Another client, a woman who had watched part of Milton's removal from the reception area, asked quietly if it had been necessary. Emmett replied without hesitation that security had acted appropriately and that it wasn't the first time someone had come in under false pretenses. The woman said no more, but didn't return the next week for her appointment. Later that evening, Evelyn received a phone call from someone she didn't recognize, an assistant from the Andersall Preservation Office. The tone was firm but courteous. They were following up regarding an unacknowledged site visit by their executive trustee, Evelyn Leet. She said no such person had appeared. She claimed the staff had been attentive. The assistant listened quietly, thanked her for her time, and hung up. Within the hour, Evelyn called Emmett to her office and instructed him to stay quiet if asked about the incident. She said the man had clearly tried to cause confusion and that any hint of wrongdoing would reflect poorly on everyone involved. Emmett nodded, reassured that his actions were supported. The next morning, news spread through financial circles about a high-value trust re-evaluating their banking partnerships. No official names were released, but rumors began. Employees at Claiborne Reserve didn't notice the shift at first. They were still joking about the man in the lobby, still trading punchlines. Someone pinned a crude drawing of a man in an oversized coat with a question mark above his head to the bulletin board near the staff room. Nobody removed it. By the end of the week, the branch had lost 3 legacy clients without explanation. Department heads received quiet inquiries about an incident report that did not exist. Evelyn received an internal message requesting clarification. She deleted it. Rhonda tried again to bring up Milton's documents. Evelyn snapped again. Rhonda backed down. She began saving copies of every email related to the incident on a flash drive she kept in her purse, just in case. Across town, Milton sat in a private office surrounded by legal counsel and financial representatives. He said very little. He listened. Every entry, every signature, every authorization had been carefully timed. The trust's movement would be thorough, legal, clean, and irreversible. But as he sat in that moment, his mind returned not to the numbers or signatures, but to the faces that had surrounded him in the bank's lobby, the ones who had watched, who had smirked, who had turned away, and, more haunting than any insult, the ones who had said nothing. Across town, inside the second-floor lounge of Claiborne Reserve Bank, the Friday afternoon crowd was thinning out. Clients were wrapping up meetings, some sipping the last of their coffee, others reviewing documents, nodding to tellers as they passed. Among them was a retired educator named Margaret Daly, a soft-spoken woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a reputation for asking questions that made junior advisors nervous. She had been seated near the reception area on the day of Milton's incident. She had seen him dragged, seen the notebook fall, seen the discomfort on the young intern's face before he laughed along with the others. She had wanted to say something, had even stood up half out of her chair when it happened, but the weight of the room's silence and the authority of Emmett Doyle's movements had pulled her back down. Since then, she had told herself she would ask someone. She would raise the issue quietly, maybe to a manager she trusted. But when she tried to bring it up that morning to her portfolio advisor, the conversation was redirected, the tension ignored. He said he hadn't heard about any such event. He assured her the staff at Claiborne were highly trained. Margaret let the conversation end there, her voice fading like a candle flickering too close to wind. That same morning, at the branch's lower level, another employee, Josephine Marks, who worked in account management, walked past the break room and saw a group of staff huddled around a phone, still laughing at a meme someone had made. It was a caricature drawn crudely on a napkin and then uploaded into a group chat labeled The Suit. The drawing showed a man with an oversized head, wearing a rumpled coat and dragging a huge book labeled My Fake Fortune. Josephine stopped in the hallway, watched them laugh, and felt a quiet sickness in her stomach. She didn't laugh. She turned around and returned to her desk. She opened her inbox, hovered her mouse over the internal ethics complaint form, and then minimized the window without clicking. She told herself she didn't have all the facts, that someone else would report it if it were serious, that maybe it wasn't what it looked like. At the main entrance, Emmett stood as usual, greeting high-value clients with an easy smile, firm handshake, and practiced charm. His badge sat square on his chest, his uniform pristine. He looked like a man proud of his authority, confident in the approval of his superiors. He noticed Josephine walk by, her expression tight, her hands clenched. He didn't ask her anything. He didn't have to. He had learned over years of work how to silence people without ever raising his voice. Upstairs, Evelyn Kerr received a summary from corporate about a potential client realignment connected to a trust institution. She read the memo twice, then tossed it into her locked drawer. She had already instructed Rhonda to delete any old references to Milton Tarot from their appointment system. She had already signed off on the internal statement that no violation had occurred. She had already told her team that if anyone asked about the incident, the official line was confusion, miscommunication, false identity. No one pushed back. The culture of silence had already taken root. Rhonda, despite her instincts, obeyed. She told herself that standing alone against leadership wasn't brave, it was naive. She told herself that she had bills, a mortgage, a son starting college. She told herself that sometimes silence was survival. Back at the trust office, Milton met with legal advisors to finalize the structure of the withdrawals. The process would span multiple days, involve multiple accounts, and would comply with all federal reporting. But the message would be unmistakable. Claiborne Reserve Bank would lose custody of the full $2.5 billion portfolio, and with it, it's standing among other institutional clients who looked to the trust as a benchmark. The trustees had agreed unanimously. They had seen the evidence. The voice recordings Milton had made in his notebook, recordings of staff mocking him, refusing assistance, and dismissing his authority, were legal, admissible, and damning. But Milton had decided not to release them. Not yet. He didn't want outrage. He wanted change. Back at the bank, another figure stirred with discomfort. A junior manager named Louis Simmons, who had witnessed the tail end of Milton's removal but said nothing at the time, found himself haunted by it days later. He had heard the jokes, had seen the cartoons, had read the memo that instructed staff to disregard any stories related to the incident. That morning, as he reviewed his monthly team evaluations, his conscience finally buckled under the weight of passivity. He opened a new message, addressed it to regional compliance, and began typing a short, factual account of what he had seen. But halfway through he stopped. His fingers hovered above the keys. The fear of being isolated, of being labeled disloyal, of becoming the subject of his own breakroom whispers was too strong. He deleted the message. Milton's name never reached his screen again. Over the weekend, the silence spread. Clients who had witnessed pieces of the incident told themselves they didn't understand the full context. Employees who knew what had happened rationalized that it wasn't their place to question leadership. Friends who had heard second-hand stories laughed along, so they wouldn't be the one to ruin the mood. Even those who felt the wrongness in their bones found ways to justify doing nothing. It wasn't their problem. They weren't involved. They hadn't meant harm. And yet, each of them had carried one brick in the wall that kept Milton out. By Monday morning, the branch's atmosphere had shifted. 3 trust accounts had been flagged for closure. Evelyn received an email from a senior partner asking for a detailed explanation. She replied with vague language, citing strategic reallocation and operational efficiency. But the partner wasn't convinced. He began his own inquiry. Rhonda received an anonymous envelope with a printed page from the trust website, highlighting Milton Tarot's role. There was no note, just the page. She stared at it, heart pounding, then shredded it without telling anyone. Josephine watched from her office window as a black town car parked across the street. Milton stepped out, dressed in a clean navy suit, coat neatly pressed, no bruises visible. He didn't enter the bank. His face was calm, expression neutral, posture upright. From across the street, a pedestrian paused briefly to glance at him, as though sensing something unusual in the quiet intensity of the man's presence. Milton stepped across the street, entered the same revolving doors of Claiborne Reserve Bank, and walked into the lobby once again. The marble floors were no different. The chandeliers still refracted the same sterile glow, and the scent of polished wood and filtered air had not changed. But something in the room felt colder than before, as though the very architecture had learned to expect submission from men who looked like Milton. As he passed the welcome desk, Emmett Doyle, standing in the same position as last week, recognized him immediately. The smirk that usually followed Emmett's recognition of someone he disdained did not appear this time. Instead, his face hardened into a scowl. Emmett stepped forward and blocked Milton's path again, placing one hand on the stanchion rope, the other resting casually on his belt. His stance was wide, commanding, and it echoed the same posture he'd used the first time he dragged Milton across the lobby floor. Milton did not flinch. He did not speak. He simply reached into his inner coat pocket and produced a small document sleeve, handing it directly to Emmett without expression. Emmett took it, opened the flap, scanned the words, frowned, and folded it back up without care. He said nothing to Milton, just turned and walked briskly toward the side hallway. Milton stood silently for a moment, then followed, the distance between them deliberate and measured. Clients in the waiting area glanced up but quickly returned to their magazines. One woman in a navy pantsuit who had witnessed the earlier incident instinctively looked down at her shoes, pretending not to see the man she had once assumed was a trespasser. They reached the same glass-walled interview room as before. Emmett gestured inside, and Milton stepped in without protest. The room had been tidied since his last visit. The stale water pitcher was gone. A fresh set of financial forms sat in a leather folder on the table, unmarked. Milton sat, placed his notebook in front of him, and waited. Emmett exited, muttering something into his radio that no one outside the security channel could hear. Upstairs, Evelyn Kerr was in the middle of a video call when Emmett notified her of Milton's return. She paused, narrowed her eyes, and asked if he had come alone. Emmett confirmed that he had. Evelyn instructed him to have Milton wait. She needed time. After ending the call, she summoned Rhonda and ordered her to print a generic trust client dismissal form. Rhonda paused, then quietly asked if she should check the central registry first. Evelyn snapped that it wasn't necessary and reminded her to act quickly. Rhonda obeyed. 20 minutes passed. Milton remained seated, hands folded, notebook closed. His expression did not change, though his eyes scanned the corners of the room with quiet precision. He had already counted the ceiling tiles, noted the location of the air vent, the angle of the mounted camera, and the slight unevenness in the tile grout near the table leg. every detail recorded, every piece of indifference silently absorbed. He was not there for a fight. He was there for confirmation. Emmett returned without knocking, entered the room with an envelope, and dropped it on the table. Milton did not reach for it. Emmett leaned slightly closer and said that if Milton didn't leave voluntarily, management had authorized his removal. Still, Milton did not respond. He simply slid the envelope across the table and opened it with deliberate slowness. Inside was a client dismissal form, unsigned, undated, and filled with generic legal phrasing. Milton looked at it for several seconds, then gently placed it back inside the envelope and returned it to the center of the table. Emmett remained standing, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Milton reached into his folio and pulled out a single document. He placed it on top of the envelope, turned it so the top faced Emmett, and slid it forward. Emmett glanced at it and paused. The heading was unmistakable. Legal withdrawal order. Signed. Authorized. Recorded. With the Claiborne Reserve routing numbers and corresponding account codes clearly marked. At the bottom of the page was the signature of a federal compliance officer confirming the instruction was irreversible. Emmett's posture changed. He stepped back slightly, uncertain now. He said nothing. He picked up the document and walked out. Milton remained seated. Upstairs, Evelyn received the withdrawal order with tight lips and clenched hands. She read it 3 times. Her stomach turned. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed the man would either lash out or disappear. She had not prepared for silence armed with documentation. She called legal. They confirmed its validity. She called corporate. They asked why she hadn't notified them of this account earlier. She had no good answer. She called Emmett and told him not to let the man leave until she said so. Emmett returned to the interview room and told Milton to remain seated. Milton nodded once and stayed exactly where he was. 20 minutes passed, then 40. No one returned. No one offered water. No one spoke. Clients came and went upstairs, unaware that an earthquake was forming in the basement of their trust. At 11:43, Evelyn entered the room herself. She was wearing a slate blazer and heels that clicked against the floor as she walked. Her face was composed, but her breathing betrayed her. She sat across from Milton, stared at him, and said nothing for several seconds. Milton returned her gaze, but his face held no emotion. She attempted a smile, said she was confused about the nature of his visit. Milton did not respond. She asked if he would consider postponing the transfer. Milton reached into his notebook and removed a smaller envelope. He handed it to her. Inside was a copy of the incident report prepared by the Andersall Trust's legal department. It detailed everything from Emmett's physical aggression to Evelyn's recorded refusal to verify credentials to staff misconduct and failure to protect fiduciary transparency. Evelyn paled. She said nothing. Milton reached into his folio one last time and handed her a USB drive. It contained audio. Not made public. Not yet. Evelyn placed the envelope and USB on the table and folded her hands. She said she would need time to review it. Milton stood. He collected his documents. He reached for his notebook, adjusted his coat, and looked once more at Evelyn. Still, he said nothing. Then he turned and left the room. Emmett was waiting in the hallway. Behind him, the towering facade of Claiborne Reserve Bank stood exactly as it had every day before, glass reflecting the sky, marble columns reaching upward. But something beneath its surface had begun to shift. Inside, Evelyn Kerr had not moved from her seat in the interview room. She remained seated at the polished table, hands folded, eyes staring at the envelope and USB drive in front of her, as if the weight of those small items had doubled in gravity. The file folder containing the trust's legal audit had already spelled out her failure. It contained transcripts, policy citations, timestamps, and most damaging of all, staff testimonies submitted to the trust's legal team by employees at other branches who had since come forward. The USB, she knew, contained the worst of it. Audio recordings of her own voice dismissing Milton's identity. Recordings of Emmett dragging him across the marble floor. Jokes made by staff. the casual cruelty spoken behind closed doors that now threatened to become public record. She felt a burn of shame rise in her neck, but it clashed with something else deeper and older: entitlement, denial, a belief that whatever she had done was merely protocol. She reached for her phone and called the bank's regional director. The call went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. Instead, she stood up, collected the materials, and walked briskly to her office, her heels clicking faster than usual, heart thumping behind her ribs like a hand banging on a locked door. Doyle remained posted at the main entrance, but he was no longer telling jokes or smiling at clients. He had seen Milton walk out with poise, had heard Evelyn's voice crack when she told him to stay put after the meeting, had sensed the unraveling that now coiled in the pit of his stomach. He stood there stiffly, hands clasped behind his back, eyes on the revolving doors, but mind flooded with doubt. For the first time in years, he wondered if he had gone too far. Not because someone told him, not because he regretted the dragging or the smirking or the mocking, but because the man he had dismissed as another nobody now held power that could reach far beyond these walls. At corporate headquarters, just blocks away, the trust transfer authorization had been officially logged. By mid-afternoon, notifications were hitting inboxes in the finance, legal, and executive teams. The numbers were exact, the documentation airtight. A full divestment. Every dollar of the Andersall Preservation Trust, an account that had propped up the bank's quarterly prestige reports, was being moved out. No press release was issued, no public announcement made, but within hours, the reverberations were felt in executive circles. Calls were made. Calendars were rearranged. Lawyers drafted statements. At Claiborne Reserve's front desk, a senior client manager named Stuart Langford finally recognized the name Milton while reviewing portfolio adjustments. He froze when he connected the dots. A trust withdrawal of that size was catastrophic for a branch of their standing. He pulled up the incident report from the prior week and scanned the internal logs. There was nothing substantial recorded. No official record of Milton's visit. No documentation of the altercation. No flag. No staff comment. It was as if the man had never existed within the bank's official history. Stuart felt sweat form under his collar. He left his desk and walked directly into Evelyn's office without knocking. She looked up from her computer, eyes wild, fingers clenched tightly around a pen. He demanded to know what had happened. Evelyn remained silent for several seconds before standing and walking to her office door, closing it slowly. She then turned and handed him the USB drive. Stuart took it with trembling fingers, plugged it into his laptop, and played the first recording. The sounds that filled the room were unmistakable: laughter, mockery, Emmett's voice dragging Milton across the lobby, Evelyn dismissing his credentials, staff ridiculing the man's coat and notebook. Stuart listened without speaking. He removed the USB, closed the laptop, and stood. He said nothing to Evelyn. He simply walked out. Downstairs, Emmett noticed Stuart leaving, his face pale, jaw tight. Emmett looked away. Staff across the bank had begun hearing fragments of conversations. Words like trust withdrawal, legal risk, compliance audit. The atmosphere, once smug and confident, now rippled with uncertainty. Rhonda, still seated at her desk outside Evelyn's office, opened a blank email draft and began typing a resignation letter. She didn't send it yet, but she kept the window open. Meanwhile, Milton returned to his office on the top floor of the historical building where the Andersall Trust had been headquartered for nearly 4 decades. The lobby receptionist greeted him respectfully, and the elevator took him directly to his private floor. His office, framed in warm wood and soft lighting, was a stark contrast to the sterile arrogance of Claiborne Reserve. He placed his notebook on the table, sat in his chair, and stared out the window. He didn't smile. He didn't feel triumph. What he felt was a quiet steadiness, the kind of stillness earned only after enduring what should never have been endured. The chair across from him was soon occupied by a young associate from the Trust's PR department. She had been tasked with drafting a public-facing explanation in case the bank tried to spin the story. Milton waved off the idea of a press release. He instructed her instead to prepare a report for internal trustees, detailing the incident, documenting the outcome, and suggesting new policy measures for vetting financial partners based on cultural accountability. She nodded, took notes, and left the room. Milton leaned back, hands folded, the weight of silence heavier than ever, but now fortified with clarity. Across the city, clients of Claiborne Reserve began receiving notices of shifting financial strategy. Some ignored it. Others made calls. A few called their representatives at the bank to ask if the rumors were true. Staff stumbled over their words. By evening, the board of directors was informed. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Evelyn was told to prepare a formal statement. Emmett was placed on administrative review. Rhonda, sensing the coming collapse, printed every email she had flagged, including the ones she had been ordered to delete. She placed the folder in her briefcase and left the building without saying goodbye. That night, Milton sat on his apartment balcony with a cup of tea, watching the lights flicker across the city skyline. He thought of the first time he had entered Claiborne Reserve, of the humiliation, of the silence that followed, of the people who had chosen to laugh instead of ask, to mock instead of intervene. Preservation Trust, executed under the name of Milton Tarot, executive trustee. No one spoke as they took their seats, and no one dared make eye contact with Evelyn Kerr, who sat with her hands locked together on the polished table, posture tense, face drained of color, her composure clinging to the last threads of plausible professionalism. Beside her, Emmett Doyle sat rigidly, forced to attend under advisory status, no longer in uniform, his badge temporarily suspended pending internal review. His face betrayed little emotion, but his eyes flickered constantly, as though still scanning for exits or threats. Across the table, Stuart Langford cleared his throat, placed the USB drive on the table, and tapped it once with a single finger, not for theatrics, but for certainty, to mark the moment. It was no longer a question of what had happened, but of how much damage had been done. The drive had been played in full by the compliance team, and it was confirmed that all audio was authentic. Emmett's voice was heard dragging a client without due process. Evelyn's voice was heard denying validation of credentials presented in good faith. Staff voices were heard mocking, laughing, inventing nicknames, and dismissing the legitimacy of the man they had deemed out of place solely by appearance. The man whose name now filled legal documentation, press queries, and internal loss reports. The man who, with fewer than 200 words spoken across 2 visits, had brought the bank to the edge of a reputational collapse. Stuart began to read aloud from the internal memo issued by the Trust's legal counsel. It stated clearly that all assets had been legally and irrevocably transferred from Claiborne Reserve, that the Trust had ceased all association with the institution, and that a copy of their audit findings would be submitted to federal oversight boards, as required by fiduciary governance policy. No lawsuit had been filed, but the threat hung in the air like static. The silence in the boardroom stretched long and thin, broken only by the occasional rustle of paper or shifting of weight in high-backed leather chairs. Evelyn finally spoke. She claimed the incident had been an unfortunate miscommunication. She repeated the word protocol twice, then compliance. Her voice trembled slightly as she said she had acted in good faith based on perceived risk. No one responded. Emmett said nothing. He stared at the tabletop, the skin around his knuckles tight with tension. The head of risk management, a man named Gordon Reeves, quietly asked how no one had checked the trust registry. Evelyn did not answer. Rhonda, now seated 3 chairs down with a folder of printed emails in her lap, raised her hand slightly, then lowered it. She wanted to speak. She had emails, instructions, denials, all of it saved. But for now she waited. She wanted to hear them say it. After the meeting adjourned, 2 executives stayed behind to speak with Evelyn privately. They told her, with forced professionalism, that a statement would be prepared acknowledging a failure in client handling, that internal disciplinary actions would be reviewed and disclosed, and that her position would be evaluated based on her cooperation during the resolution process. She asked if she was being fired. They said not yet. She asked if corporate was coming. They said yes. Evelyn nodded once, then left the room, her steps slow, each one dragging her further from the pedestal she had built for herself. In the days that followed, the name Milton Tarot appeared in internal training documents distributed to every Claiborne Reserve branch nationwide. The documents did not mention the incident directly, but referenced the importance of proper client identification, verification, and procedural humility in dealing with all clients, regardless of appointment status or appearance. Emmett was officially suspended without pay pending final investigation. His union representative requested a copy of the USB recordings. They were granted access. Within hours, Emmett's face lost the last of its stubborn pride. He tried to justify his actions, citing previous incidents, saying the man had acted suspiciously. But the audio betrayed his narrative. There was no shouting, no threatening behavior, no refusal to comply. Only silence, only calm, only patience. Rhonda submitted her resignation 3 days later. She included a formal memo outlining every step of the event, every ignored document, every refusal to verify the client's identity. She made it clear that while she had complied under duress, she could no longer participate in a workplace that rewarded arrogance over accountability. Her resignation spread through internal channels like a crack in a mirror, small but impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, outside the institution, word had begun to spread among financial circles. The trust's withdrawal did not go unnoticed. Competing institutions scrambled to make contact with the Andersall Trust, offering proposals, incentives, and apologies for past failures. The trust declined all meetings for the time being. Milton had made it clear that they were not interested in relationships built on reaction. They wanted partners who led with integrity. Quietly, a journalist from a respected financial outlet reached out to the trust's communications team, asking for comment on the withdrawal. The inquiry was forwarded to Milton. He read it, paused, then dictated a brief statement. It contained no accusations, no names, only this: all clients deserve to be seen before they are judged, heard before they are dismissed, and respected before they are challenged. We do not measure the strength of a bank by its marble, its glass, or its columns, but by the decency of those who serve behind its counters. The statement was published in a Sunday feature on ethical finance. It was read by thousands. Within 2 weeks, 2 more high-net-worth clients quietly ended their relationships with Claiborne Reserve. No explanations were given. Inside the bank, morale collapsed. Staff were unsure whom to trust. Whispers filled the hallways, and eyes darted from desk to desk like animals sensing fire behind the walls. Evelyn's office remained closed most of the time. She spent her days drafting reports, attending force sensitivity training, and watching her career disintegrate one email at a time. Emmett's suspension became permanent. He was told he could reapply for positions in the future at branches not affiliated with the corporate trust division, pending public relations clearance. He declined. He packed his things in silence. When he left, no one clapped. No one looked up. Milton, from his office, did not celebrate. He did not smile. He simply moved forward. He approved the final stage of the trust's reinvestment plan. He signed new agreements with smaller community-focused institutions. He oversaw the publication of a revised fiduciary conduct guideline for partner institutions, written not in legal jargon but in plain language, rooted in respect. The authorizations were valid. The audit trail precise. There was no angle to spin, no media leak to plug, and no policy loophole big enough to justify what had happened on the marble floors of their flagship branch just 2 weeks prior. Every branch manager in the region was ordered to review protocol. Every staff member was mandated to attend a full-day workshop on unconscious bias and client verification. But none of it could erase the footage, the audio, or the names already circulating in quiet conversations among clients, regulators, and rival institutions who had wasted no time exploiting Claiborne's sudden vulnerability. Evelyn Kerr, once a rising executive with a portfolio full of regional accolades, was officially demoted to a non-client-facing operational role, pending reassignment. The press release described it as a strategic shift in leadership focus. Internally, her badge access was restricted. Her nameplate was removed from the door before the ink dried on the HR documentation. She now sat in a corner cubicle with no view and a terminal that hadn't been updated in over a year. Her inbox was flooded with ignored escalations, follow-up requests she could no longer answer, and automated system messages reminding her of deadlines she no longer had the authority to meet. She stopped wearing heels. She stopped speaking in meetings. She stopped correcting people when they passed her by as if she were invisible. Doyle, formerly the lead security officer and one-time pride of the lobby floor, found himself at a desk inside a third-party contracting firm, far from the prestige and polish of his former post. After his termination from Claiborne Reserve, he had struggled to find work, as the termination details had been quietly but definitively shared among partners. His union could do little in the face of indisputable evidence. The audio had destroyed plausible deniability. The footage confirmed his actions. The public never saw it, but corporate had. And those few minutes of recorded arrogance had effectively ended his career. He no longer wore a badge. He no longer gave orders. He now sat quietly behind a screen, monitoring warehouses for inventory compliance, speaking only when spoken to. His wife asked him once if he regretted how he treated that man. He said nothing. Across the city, Claiborne's marketing team scrambled to soften the blow. They launched a new brand campaign centered around inclusion and empathy, complete with pastel graphics, stock footage of diverse families smiling at tablet screens, and slogans about modern values. It fooled no one. Clients knew what had happened. The story had never gone viral, never made the national headlines, but in the world of wealth and trust management, reputation traveled faster than press releases. Long-time clients began requesting audits. New accounts stalled before completion. Partnerships that had been guaranteed suddenly dried up without explanation. One by one, the dominoes fell. An art fund based in Connecticut withdrew its holdings. A real estate syndicate in Oregon paused negotiations. A private university trust in Massachusetts announced a delay in contract renewal. Each of these losses cost Claiborne tens of millions in projected revenue, but more importantly, they cost credibility, something that could not be rebuilt with brochures or webinars. Stuart Langford, the client manager who had first connected the dots, was quietly reassigned to a special task force meant to analyze institutional risk. He accepted the assignment, though he resented the underlying motive. He now spent his days reviewing emails, cross-checking employee performance reviews, and assessing whether anyone else posed a liability. He submitted reports weekly. None of them changed the past. Rhonda, the assistant who had resigned in quiet defiance, received a personal call from a competing bank, one that had seen her resignation letter leaked internally and admired her decision to document everything. She was offered a senior operations position with better pay, better hours, and a culture that claimed, at least in its language, to welcome integrity. She accepted. When asked why she left Claiborne, she said only that some silences are heavier than others. Meanwhile, Milton remained outside the noise. He did not attend interviews. He did not speak on panels. He declined all media inquiries. He was not interested in becoming a symbol. He was interested in continuity, in legacy, in making sure that the institutions entrusted with society's wealth were accountable not just to numbers, but to people. He worked quietly behind the scenes, reviewing the reinvestment plans for the Andersall Trust, ensuring that every cent was redirected to institutions that demonstrated, through action, that humility was not a press tactic, but a cultural commitment. He reviewed diversity audits. He required internal video footage during partner onboarding. He asked for community engagement logs. And when he found gaps, he raised questions, not with outrage, but with precision. His silence had once been misread as weakness. Now, it was interpreted as gravity. His presence in any meeting made people sit straighter, choose their words more carefully, and listen longer. One evening, he received a letter. Not an email, not a press release, but a physical envelope, handwritten, slightly uneven. It was from a junior associate at Claiborne's branch, someone who had laughed the day Milton was dragged across the floor but had not spoken since. The letter was not an apology. It was a confession. The associate admitted his silence, admitted his laughter, admitted his discomfort afterward, and his inability to speak up when it mattered. He wrote that he no longer wanted to be the kind of person who needed to see someone suffer to understand the cost of silence. Milton read the letter once. He placed it in a drawer. He wrote nothing in reply. He did not need to. The letter had already done its work. At Claiborne's annual shareholder meeting, the question of the trust departure was raised indirectly. An investor asked about regional performance. The CEO dodged the question with a polished statement about market volatility. No one mentioned Milton's name, but they all knew. They knew the name that had forced their hands, that had unseated careers, that had exposed the difference between policy and practice. Prestige, the story of Milton Taro's quiet but decisive justice, continued to move through the financial industry not as a scandal, but as a shift, an awakening that rippled far beyond conference calls, quarterly reports, or compliance retraining modules. It became a benchmark, not just of failure, but of consequence, of what happened when institutions built on exclusion were finally held accountable by the very people they had once overlooked. It was not spoken loudly. It didn't need to be. The damage had already become the message. Inside Claiborne's corporate headquarters, now stripped of its gold-trimmed illusion of invulnerability, the remaining leadership implemented mandatory empathy programs and restructured their trust oversight process. But for many, the changes were not moral reckonings. They were precautions, self-serving acts of preservation designed to prevent further loss. The culture of indifference still lingered in corners, whispered in back rooms, carried by those who had survived the purge but had not changed. But beneath the surface, something had begun to shift. The name Milton Taro was no longer just associated with a withdrawal. It was invoked during policy discussions, referenced during ethics training, and even printed on a new internal memo titled Client Treatment and Cultural Respect Initiative, though Milton himself had never signed off on any such title. His presence had outlasted his physical visits. His impact had become institutional memory. Yet Milton did not seek to be remembered. He had no interest in monuments or credit. He believed that justice, when pursued correctly, left no fingerprints. It left understanding. While Claiborne attempted its recovery, Milton was already several steps ahead, working with smaller banks and community-based investment firms to implement more human-centered accountability standards. He chaired a new oversight board composed of individuals from diverse backgrounds who had previously been excluded from major financial decision-making. Their job was not just to advise on structure, but to challenge assumptions, to ensure that the quiet dismissal of voices like Milton's could never again happen without consequence. The board's first report was simple and piercing. It read, "If the structure makes someone invisible, the structure is wrong." The report was distributed to over 60 institutions across the country. Only 20 responded. Of those, only 7 committed to a meeting. Milton attended each one. He sat in rooms where smiles were polite but nerves ran high, where executives offered coffee but not eye contact. And each time, Milton began the conversation not with data, but with a question. What does respect look like before the mistake is made? Most didn't have an answer, but some began to ask the same question in return. At Claiborne, Evelyn's reassignment eventually turned into resignation. She offered no farewell message, left no letter, and packed her belongings in silence. Her departure went unacknowledged by the very colleagues who once admired her, who had laughed at her jokes, who had followed her directives without question. She moved to a quieter city and began consulting on risk mitigation, but she carried the weight of her past like a chain with no lock. Emmett, now working part-time in retail security, no longer gave speeches about protocol or presence. He stood silently by doors that led nowhere important, his authority reduced to checking receipts and counting heads. One afternoon, he caught his own reflection in a storefront mirror and saw a man who had confused power with purpose, a man whose grip on another human being had cost him everything he thought he had earned. For a long time, he stared at that reflection, not with anger, but with a hollow kind of recognition. Elsewhere, Milton visited a charter school funded by the trust, where he spoke to students about equity, not as a concept, but as a practice. He told them that dignity was not given, it was defended, sometimes not with protest or violence, but with precision, with truth, with silence that waited until it was undeniable. One student, a young black girl with curious eyes and a relentless question in her voice, asked him what had changed after all that had happened. Milton paused before answering. He said that some people learned that silence had a cost, that pretending not to see was no longer free, that power misused was not just dangerous but unstable, always ready to crumble the moment it faced its own reflection. He said that change does not begin with apologies, but with choices. After the talk, the principal pulled Milton aside and thanked him, not just for his words, but for his example. She said the story had already reached their classrooms, and the students had started to ask harder questions of the world around them. That, Milton thought, was worth more than any boardroom turnaround or public statement. In the final days of the fiscal quarter, Milton submitted his last report as executive trustee before passing the role to his successor, a woman named Alana Brookshire, who had worked quietly behind the scenes for years and had earned the position through integrity and discipline. He told her that the job was not about wealth, it was about weight. The weight of choices, the weight of silence, the weight of what institutions could become if left unchallenged. Alana accepted the responsibility with humility. She had seen firsthand what happened when one man chose not to scream, but to act. As Milton stepped down, he did not celebrate. He did not host a farewell gala or pose for photos. He simply sent a note to the board thanking them for their trust, signed his name, and walked out of the building. Outside, the city carried on. Cars passed, people moved, lives continued. No headlines marked his exit. No applause followed him. But somewhere in a boardroom he would never enter, a policy was rewritten because of him. Somewhere, a guard hesitated before grabbing someone's arm. Somewhere, a client was asked for their name without being judged by their skin. These moments would not be tracked. They would not be quantified. But they would happen. They were already happening. Because the real end of injustice does not come when the guilty are punished. It comes when those who watched in silence learn to speak. It comes when those who once turned away choose to stand. It comes when names are no longer dismissed, but remembered. Milton Taro never raised his voice. He never demanded his place. He simply waited until they realized he had always been there. And when they finally looked up, when they finally saw him, it was not his title or his wealth that made them pause. It was his dignity. And that, in the end, changed everything. The end. If this story made you think twice about what true respect looks like, if it made you feel the weight of silence, the power of restraint, and the cost of ignoring someone's worth, go ahead and like this video to help more people hear what dignity in action really sounds like. Subscribe if you want more stories that reveal injustice without shouting, that show quiet strength triumphing over loud arrogance. We want to hear your thoughts. What part of Milton's journey struck you the hardest? Was it the moment he was dragged across the floor? The silent weight in that glass room? Or the calm way he changed everything without raising his voice? Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. Your voice matters here, because the world changes when people start paying attention.